Ababio is a name that references a majority ethnic group. But behind that are minority ethnic group experiences. So from a very early age, I had to negotiate how I presented my identity. Would I be comfortable to allow those minority ethnic voices to come through? Or would I just pass as what my name represents? So from a very early stage, these conflicts were stirred up just by virtue of the post-colonial experience, English being the lingua franca, impacting the Ghanaian identity, parents then beginning to mix, not being able to speak each other's mother tongues, me being a product of that, and having to navigate and negotiate all these different identities. So that is it. That's where it began. And I chose to begin to embrace all of me.
Okay.
And coming to Britain, arriving in the winter of '91, I came with all of these conflicts. Came with having interacted with books on my mom's bookshelf, Frank Fanon, on my dad's bookshelf. I say on my dad and my mom's because they're separated. I go in touch with books by Frederick Douglass, African American activist and journalist. Books by Chinua Achebe, Ayiko Yama, all writing about the post-colonial experience and the new African identity. But I would call all of this my cultural, if you like, collateral, my cultural collateral in coming to the UK. But that wasn't sufficient to protect me from what confronted me in the UK, being different, being now a minority. Being a minority in Britain also stirred up the previous issues that I'd had, being a product of minority and majority ethnic groups in Ghana. So the impact of racism, and also now getting to grips with a new cultural terrain. I had been schooled to speak English, but my English in the UK was sort of different. I had an accent, so the difference got amplified, and all these issues took me into counselling because they were stirring up anxieties for me. I was developing a low mood, and I had to really look at these issues and address it within the counseling context, which led me into wanting to work with people, firstly young people, in the borough of Enfield, which exposed me to all sorts of professionals, social workers, psychiatrists, psychotherapists. So I delved into working in community mental health at the very cold face of it, being a befriender, working with very complex issues, and then managing services at a higher managerial sort of level. I trained as a counselor, and I was intrigued by psychoanalytic concepts because it was an integrative counseling training, and I decided that I wanted to delve a bit more deeply into counseling, to train further as a psychotherapist. But I felt a leaning towards psychoanalytic ideas, particularly ideas by Melanie Klein. But in choosing the training, how do I then address my experience as a Black man? So at that time, there was a training that was being set up by the organization that I still work for, NAFCIAT, and they had collaborated with University College London and had put up a course which was an amalgam of psychoanalytic training and intercultural ideas. So it was a psychoanalytic psychotherapy intercultural training, which is what I did, and I haven't regretted it. But I must say that was the beginning of my journey, finishing training, and that was in the early, it's around 2001 when I qualified, um, and still learning. So that's been that's been what's led me to
the counseling. Very interesting
yeah.
journey. I'm going to ask how, when you say to other black male or other black men, this is what I do, what response do you get?
Oh, there are a range of reactions, Lydia. Um, one of which is the, if you like, the fallback into uh, humor, using humor as a defense. So, oh, I think you're going to, I'm sure you get some of that yourself. I hope you haven't been analyzing me. And then it becomes something of a guard being put up. Some get really interested in wanting to ask me more about what it entails, what sort of people I see, what sort of problems I sort of work with, which I think signals sometimes that they perhaps might be asking those questions either for themselves or for people that they know. So it's a mix between surprise, defense, curiosity, interest, and wanting to know more. Yes.
And
Yeah.
one of the aims of this show is,
Mm,
well, I don't want to actually call it a show because it to me takes a little bit away from the importance of it, is to encourage, the non-Caucasian people, when I would say black, Asian, the minorities, to find counseling as a tool,
yeah.
as a as you would go to the GP if you weren't feeling well, and
Mm,
they gave you a course
mm,
of medication. And it's to really help us explore what the challenges are and
mm,
why we are. Do you think that sort of non-white, I will use that word, actually resist counseling more, or do you think it's the same regardless of where you're from?
that's a really useful question. Um, I would approach it by perhaps looking at certain barriers to the counseling engagement. I think, firstly, if you look at mental health broadly, there is a stigma attached to it, white, black. But then looking at BAME communities specifically, which is what your question is about, I would reference my own personal experience and then broaden it out to the BAME group as a whole. I grew up in a part of Ghana, Accra, and I lived in a suburb. The suburb was called, listen to the name of that suburb, Asylum Down. Now, asylum, as you know, refers to a place, a hospital, people who may have mental health issues. So we lived downhill from the one of the biggest psychiatric hospitals in the capital of Accra, and often you'd find patients wandering about sometimes in the neighborhood, and quite sad scenes to witness. Some of them will wander about naked. Some will wander about with wearing rags, and talking across the sexes, male, female, scenes like that happening. So it became an experience which for me was fearful, shameful, degrading, and one which one had to detach from. What one was saying was, if you become mentally ill, what might happen to you? and therefore the feeling of repressing and hiding was sort of cultivated during that time. So we have derogatory words that we would use for mentally ill people, people who experience mental distress. You find that in Ghana. I used to travel along the west coast of Africa, the Gambia, in Wolof. There's a term there which people use commonly, which means missing a screw. In Zimbabwe, you have hospitals there which attract fear, the Saskam Hospital. And I think I'm not quite sure. There is one hospital near Lagos called Yaba, I think, which also has quite negative associations. So in Jamaica, Kingston, there is a hospital called Bellevue, which also has all these negative associations attached to it. Now, when we move from those places of origin and come here, we still carry those associations with us, fear, stigma, shame. But what gets amplified here is we come over here wanting to be successful. And any sign of being mentally ill might be viewed as failing in our quest to succeed. Now, if you factor that into the racism, which is also quite pervasive here, I mean, we know that in relation to the numbers of BAME people within the general population, they are overrepresented in psychiatric hospitals, particularly in locked wards, probation services, and prison. So, if there is this overrepresentation, there is a fear as to what might happen to me if I were to disclose that I do have a mental problems. Would I be put up in a locked ward? Because channels into treating mental problems, particularly in the 80s, were very much along those routes, locked ward section, prison. There wasn't that much, if you like, routes into counseling. And the counseling which were being sort of offered to BAME individuals perhaps weren't culturally appropriate. It didn't take into account the whole world and the difference of the BAME individuals' upbringing. And therefore, it was very Eurocentric. So these are some of the, if you like, the barriers which might sort of impede people from, if you like, the BAME community from accessing help when it comes to mental distress. And there's also perhaps spiritual elements to what the mental health distress might mean in different cultures. Yes.
And I see it as we imagine that the worst could happen. Yeah. So the worst case scenario is that if I admit that I'm stressed, I have low mood, I'm feeling a bit depressed, I'm going to end up this way. So there's no in between. We've just sort of gone all the way to the end where I'm going to be sectioned.
That is a big issue because we know prevention is key in addressing any sort of disorder, be it physical, but we're talking about mental health issues. So prevention is very crucial that if you catch it early, I think the outcome could be positive. But what we're saying is that it is repressed, it is hidden. There are notions around mental health which sort of keep a lid on it, shame, fear, and therefore help becomes help is accessed at the point of crisis.
Yes, when it's almost too late.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
So if somebody is, or anybody watching now, what would be, I know this is just generic, it's not, like what would be a few signs, a few things that I could notice?
I think there are areas around symptoms around anxiety. um, which can be manifested by sort of lack of sleep, um, disturbed um, um, sort of appetite, not eating properly, um, some sort of ideas around hypervigilance. Um, and it could also have the, because depression and anxiety, if you like, are the two sides of the same coin.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So the other side will be symptoms around depression. These are what you call the common mental health problems.
Yeah.
Yes. Much of which are to deal with sleep, uh, mood changes, um, perhaps not being able to socialize, withdrawal. And therefore, when you begin to notice these areas of perhaps somebody withdrawing, you might not live in the same house as that person. Perhaps that person isn't telephoning you as often as they used to, or perhaps not picking up your calls. You might want to wonder what's happening, not meeting up with friends. So these are sort of clues. Sometimes when people live in nuclear sort of families, perhaps the children or the wife, it depends on what sort of family you're in. They might notice it, but they also have to be, because it's difficult not to notice when somebody lies in bed till about 12 noon and wakes up late and eats at all times during the day. They're irritable, shouting at people, um, um, outburst, which are disproportionate to the, if you like, the trigger. Yes. So these are things that can be noticed. It depends on what the friends decide to do. Might they collude and still keep it private and say, oh, Baffour is a very private person. I really don't want to go near this. When he's ready, he might come up, but he might never talk about it. And it exacerbates and get to the point of what crisis. And these are the issues we sometimes can have an impact, not only on the one individual, but the ripples can affect, if there are children involved, it would affect the children. If there's a spouse involved, it would affect the spouse. We're then talking about extended family networks too. It can affect one's capacity to work. And you can imagine the sort of secondary sort of impact that all those, if you like, all the things I've noted might have on the people around this individual who's having this mental health issue. So it's very important to begin uh, to have the courage
So
to
to
approach.
notice and then have the courage.
Yes, not to be quiet and to be sensitively approach it. Yes.
All right. You said something about faith. You know,
What did I say? Faith.
you mentioned in your earlier on,
Okay.
um,
Okay.
we're talking about the Bain
Oh
Society,
yes.
saying that
Yes. Yes.
sometimes the way that we manage these things are influenced by faith. So,
Mm.
how do you think that takes away or adds? Um, do you feel that if people feel they're having counseling that isn't faith based, for example, they're taking away something from their own faith?
Uh, Again, if we track back to uh, looking at the way mental health issue uh, is or are depicted in the holy books of different faiths. Let's take the Christian faith, for example.
Yeah.
The word that is attached to it is possession, demonized, and these are quite very strong, if you like, um, if you like, experiences and words to use, demonized or oppressed. So there is something about that person who becomes mentally ill, which suggests that they're not spiritually right.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and therefore they require spiritual intervention.
Mm-hmm.
But we know that, again, looking at the Christian faith, the human personality is seen as a body, a soul, and a spirit, and therefore there are issues in the soulish realm which may require the intervention of a professional,
Mm-hmm.
and that professional could either be a priest or a pastor who could combine the spiritual roles as well as the priest could also be a professional counselor, and they could do both. But sometimes that isn't the case. The priest might inhabit one space, which is a spiritual space.
Mm-hmm.
And if the priest is expected to address that spiritual realm for the member of the congregation,
Mm-hmm.
um, it's not always possible to do that. And how then that this person begin to um move outside the faith community,
Mm-hmm.
or perhaps a priest being able to signpost that member of the congregation to a professional? Are they able to do that? So that's one. Two is also um, the underlying issues, or how people tend to treat the mental health issues, either by alcohol,
Mm-hmm.
by other substance abuses, or perhaps extramarital affairs.
Mm-hmm.
In certain faith communities, those areas are taboo. And what might happen is a person who's experiencing a mental health issue and is attempting to treat it with substances, it compounds it. And there is shame about, how do I say this to the pastor, the priest? It's
Mm-hmm.
shameful. I'm drinking, I'm having affairs, and I'm smoking marijuana or using cocaine. And maybe I'm quite a senior person in the church too. How do I address that? And I'm meant to be strong, and therefore I cannot go and see a counselor either.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore they're stuck in the middle, and it gets to a point of crisis. Uh, so what I'm saying is that there ought to be an opening up within faith communities, which might allow people who experience these real issues. These are human issues. Yes, okay. Um, Faith community is about helping people get better
Mm-hmm.
and grow and mature. I don't think a faith community, a church, is meant to be seen as a group of perfect people. So that notion ought to be dropped.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, the shame about issues around sin getting conflated with mental health problems, and therefore people not seeking help and falling through the cracks,
Mm-hmm.
uh, ought to be really looked at. Yes.
Mm-hmm. And
Yeah.
this concept that we're all perfect, and when that person gets to that crisis point,
Mhm.
I feel sometimes that person is now ostracized or shamed out of that faith group, and they're sort of left, to whatever happens to them. So instead of there being an embracing and a reconciliation and trying to restitute and find out how that person can be helped, sometimes they're now on the other extreme, just like we talked about the people who are unwell, shamed out of that community. So there's no support. I know people have said this to me. I don't know if you've heard it, that they don't want to go to a counselor who doesn't have faith. Do you think that impacts the work?
I think a counselor of whatever persuasion
Mm.
ought to be able to I'm reflecting from the perspective of a counselor that one ought to be able to accept the whole being of a client. So if a client approaches, if you like, a secular counselor, their faith should not be discounted. That ought to be allowed into the room and explored. Now, the drawback for the, if you like, the Christian client might be he or she is a secular therapist, counselor, in as much as they're able to allow my faith into the room. Do they really understand? Do they really understand what it means to be a Christian, what prayer is about, what the different elements in Christian practice actually mean? So perhaps for some Christian clients, it might be, it might work better to have a counselor who happens to be of their own faith, who's able to work professionally. The danger is perhaps not to allow the counseling session to become some sort of preaching and instruction and direction, because that's not the aim of counseling. As you know, it's about a journey of discovery. But I think knowing that the therapist, or counselor, is of the same faith can be of benefit in the same way that if you're a BAME individual looking for a counselor, you might want to approach a BAME counselor. Yeah, because you would hope that they might have some empathy with a Black experience, and that you wouldn't have to explain everything to them. Yes, that this is what racism is about. This is what white privilege is. This is what a microaggression is. So I think referencing that, as in the case of perhaps a Christian client having reservations about seeing a secular therapist, there is something holding and containing about a counselor who shares the same faith as a client. And I think perhaps, there are Christian counseling bodies now. It's growing. And I think much of that ought to be made a bit more public for people to know about, that there are organizations who are professionally trained but espouse certain faiths too. Yes.
Thank you. I've got a very interesting question. I'll look at it because I want to read it as it was given to me. It was a question saying that, do you think Black males are given this thing that they have to be strong? It's something that we instill into, mothers instill it, fathers instill it, and that is the expectation. So what happens when he's not feeling so strong?
Yeah, I think that falls into the general area of masculinity and vulnerability, and how people like me, because you're talking about me, I'm a Black man, how we're raised to hide our vulnerable emotions, such as being hurt or being sad. And one of the ways that we sort of learn to communicate is through anger and those sort of harsh ways of expressing ourselves, which again somehow falls into what it means to be strong. Yes, if you're angry, you're strong. If you're sad and hurt, you're weak, and therefore you don't show it. And repressing those feelings then opens up pathways, which then leads to anger, which can have disastrous effects on relationships. And the way that we, as men, deal in the area of intimacy and affection can also be taught and learned because it falls again into the area of strength, the notion of the strong black man who's able to show the affection by building a nice house, by buying things for the children, for the spouse, instead of allowing the sort of inner realities of their lives to be shared. It goes into the area of things. And when these areas are not really opened up and looked at, you find that there can be sexual issues being encountered, often non-medically unexplained sexual issues, erectile dysfunction, premature ejaculation. And these are difficult areas for men to talk about. And but underneath that might be issues around not being vulnerable. You see,
And who can,
underneath that, I'm sorry.
I said, and who can I be vulnerable to?
Yes, indeed, indeed. And when it comes even more to the black sphere of a black man, one would leave home and would have to experience one's difference. If one is a king in the castle of one's house, perhaps when one leaves home and one gets subjected to different aspects of racism, you're no longer a king. Yes,
No longer that
and
big, strong
indeed,
black
indeed,
man.
and that sits on top of it. I wrote an article which is called "The Strong Black Male" for a play called "The Barbershop Chronicles," and I explored some of these issues in it. The microaggressions, where somebody might be sitting on the tube, nobody sits near them. And I have had the urge sometimes as a black man when I'm walking behind a white woman, especially if it's a bit late in the day, I might try and hurry up to overtake them just to show that I'm not dangerous. Yes. So all of these sort of pressures on the black man require an outlet. And that outlet is what you and I are exploring, counseling. But the veneer and the facade of the strong black male would not allow that to come out easily. So it is then suppressed and kept behind.
I'm going to ask something which I think just came to me, that do you think this idea of vulnerability, hence the strong attachment to mothers? Because I think a lot of times black males can be really attached to their mothers, and when they do move on to other relationships, that thing still lingers, and that's their safe place to go to. Do you think that's connected with that, the safety and who they feel they can trust with their emotions and their fears and their doubts?
I mean, mothers, broadly speaking, are sort of the primary attachment figures. But again, that has to be questioned too, because not everyone has a mother.
Or a good
Yes,
mother?
yes, yes, a good enough mother.
Yes.
Some people are brought up by grandmothers, who again are the maternal, if you like, primary figure. Some people are brought up in care homes, and and do not have that. Um, there's often this notion that the way men are brought up sometimes by certain mothers uh, would then they are sort of predictors of how they might function. I think that's where you're moving.
Yes, that's
Um, in the sort of later relationships with the wives, the girlfriends, and we know this intersectionality uh, where different areas come together: class, gender, um, faith, but also the area of sexual orientation. You see, and it's not always that you find a male gravitating towards a female. It's I think it's now a landscape which is allowing the expression of uh, different kinds of sexual orientations. Yes, yeah. I'm not sure if I responded to your thought there.
Uh, Not completely, but I think
Yeah.
what I was aiming at was this thing around vulnerability and who can I trust. Yeah. So if I'm the king in the castle, can I trust the person that I'm engaged with, my wife, girlfriend, with my feelings and my emotions and my fears and my doubts? And if I don't find that there, does that mean I revert back to mom, or I never left mom because that's the only place I feel safe?
Ah, so what you're talking about, which I get, is to deal with how we allow men to separate.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, which is a crucial aspect of how a person develops and uh, forms their own identity, obviously based on very early relational patterns. Um, but if a person isn't allowed to leave psychologically and emotionally, we know, as you're saying, that when there is a crisis, where one goes back to is that early.
That early place, that
Yes,
safe place, the safe
yes,
place, whether it's
yes,
grandma, whether it's
yes.
auntie, whether it's mom, whoever was they feel safe enough to go back to.
But you're saying something also about, is it healthy?
Yes, that I
Yeah.
think my
Mm,
question is, if
mm,
I'm not feeling safe here, I will go to
mm,
where I feel safe.
mm,
So
mm.
who holds the power, or who holds the responsibility, or who holds what I do with how I'm feeling?
Yes.
Or do I actually go to a counselor who is not involved?
Yeah. And often the idea of mother and that early experience of mother or whoever the early primary figure might be isn't physical.
Mhm,
It's something that we carry with us. So if early relationships with that primary figure is one where a certain way of containing a blackmail's
mhm,
distress
mhm,
is activated,
mhm,
then when that person is in that place of distress as an adult, they will then go emotionally back to that space.
mhm,
You see, they might become an infant. Yes,
mhm,
yes. And how then do you deal with that? Because if one hasn't been helped uh, to separate, because perhaps the maternal figure also has needs. And the
That's right.
needs which might mean that that sort of dependency is encouraged. Yes,
Yeah. Yes.
yes. Mhm. So I think this is for all of us adults who are interested in how human beings develop uh, into healthy adults. We shouldn't say it's for mothers only. No, yes, um, mothers also need uncles, aunties, brothers to come alongside them. Yes, because it's a family that raises
That's right.
a child. Yes, and the
Do you?
idea of the family
Mhm,
is varies in different communities, isn't it? It's not only the nuclear family;
mhm,
it could be the extended. Yes,
mhm.
yeah. Sorry, I
No,
interrupted.
no. I think that would even take us to another area, because I'm thinking Do you think some of the resistance comes because culturally we're used to getting help from the extended family? Instead of going out to approach somebody, like I know in some cultures, if somebody passes, say a husband passes now, somebody will come and stay with the wife for a couple of weeks, nurse her, feed her, help with the children. But we now live in a place where that isn't so available. Do you think we're still actually stuck in those cultural nuances where,
Possibly.
so instead of that person, because everybody would come for the first week, I've seen it
Mm.
a few times, and then they
Mm.
will, and that person is left with the pain, left with the challenge of raising the children, taking them to school, and there's no place for them to actually sit and cry because now they have to go back to work, or even if they weren't working before, they are now worried about finance. So is it that sometimes we're stuck in that cultural thinking that doesn't help us access help like counseling, when somebody's been bereaved?
Yeah, I agree with that comment and thought um, that the communities that are assembled here within the BAME communities
Mhm,
uh, are communities which have been formed outside the original countries of
mhm,
origin,
mhm,
and therefore extended relations and relatives um, do not come along and travel, relocate. So new communities and new families are then assembled
mhm,
in a new host country, which is the UK. And therefore, there needs to be, uh, shall I say, the way we begin to shift our thinking
mhm.
into what other resources might there be for us to begin to access in the community. Because if the uncle is not around, if the grandfather is not around, if the older brother or sister or auntie is not around, who might I go to? Which then goes back to, are the services that I would approach good enough?
Mhm,
Will they understand my black experience that I'm coming to you because I don't have that auntie?
mhm,
They're in Bangladesh
mhm,
or they're in Zimbabwe or Ghana. I can't do that. I'm
mhm,
coming to you because I've lost that. How might you understand that loss?
mhm, mhm.
Yes, because that's a loss that's sitting there, and this
Mhm.
other loss is sitting on top of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And even that's been amplified by COVID 19 now.
Mhm,
Yes,
mhm.
that when there is bereavement at the moment, it's not possible to
Yeah.
go through the ritual that you describe, people coming around and sitting with you. That's even gone.
Mhm,
It's gone. Yeah, I know lockdown is being relaxed, but we still have the social distancing
mhm,
in
mhm.
place. Yes.
Still able
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
sit in close,
Yeah.
in close communities. Okay. If I go back to my question where I was asking about pressure being put on the black male to be strong, do you feel that when I say we, I mean all of us, is that still the expectation of the younger men now, the men that are coming up behind you? Or do you think that they can be more vulnerable?
I think it's a very hard area perhaps to shift.
Mm.
Um, but I would say that it is shifting because we're beginning to see uh, examples
Mhm,
on the media. We're beginning to see examples of, if like men in
mhm,
general, uh, showing that uh, being human involves being vulnerable,
mhm,
involves showing sadness,
mhm,
involves showing one is hurt,
mhm,
of course, and one can be angry too.
mhm,
But it's a whole spectrum. It's a whole array of emotions, and being sad and vulnerable is another crucial aspect of it. So that's there in the media,
mhm,
and it's being portrayed by uh, white men, black men,
mhm,
brown men. So the more black males are out there in the media, being able to show those sides of
mhm,
being uh, a black male, which hitherto has been denigrated,
Mm-hmm.
but it's now being, if you like, celebrated. That it's part of the male experience. I think that will then seep, because what we're looking at, Lydia, is the transmission, the generational transmission of how a black male conducts himself.
Mm-hmm.
And for that to change, I think the cycle has got to be what broken.
Mm-hmm.
And in breaking that cycle, men have got to see examples, uh, not only on the television, in their schools too, in their homes, where when father or uncle has a difficult issue, they might not go and hide somewhere. They can shed a tear or two and process it. Yeah, they can process it in front of the young black uh, uh, men,
Men.
boys.
Mm-hmm.
But you're also talking about the young black women who are also seeing the example of what it is to be a vulnerable black man,
Mm-hmm.
because that would also change their expectation when they're in relationships. Okay, because there can be a conflict where they're expecting the black man to be vulnerable, but however, they've been socialized into wanting to see the black man as also strong. Mm?
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes, that's
Yes,
our
yes,
expectation.
yes,
Our expectation.
yeah.
Yeah. Um, we're sort of coming to time, so I want us to finish the way we started with your work. How has it been for you, uh, black male therapist in an environment I think that is predominantly or used to be predominantly white? How has the journey been in terms of how you've been treated, how clients have come to you, and how they've seen you?
It,
Go on.
it's been interesting. I would say that I've been sheltered. Remember, I did my training uh, at UCL. It's quite a good place to train,
Mhm,
but it was also an intercultural psychotherapy training. So issues about difference were at the very center. So in my training, I was embraced and celebrated.
mhm,
Yes, and the work that I went on to do in community mental health in Westminster uh, was setting up projects around Black issues.
mhm,
Uh, so I was at the margins, but bringing things to the center.
mhm, mhm,
Uh, Clients would approach me based on my experience uh, or the way I look, uh, my color, uh,
mhm,
my training, my experience. They would come to me. A female black woman might come to me because they've had issues with their father.
mhm,
Uh, and they're thinking that perhaps working with a black man might begin to correct those early experiences. Uh, a black male might come to me for that. Uh, a white woman might come to me because they're in a relationship with a black man,
mhm,
and they're wanting to work through some of the issues which have come up in their relationship, uh, which is veering in the area of racism. Yes. Um, and how might they work with those conflicts, especially we're living in the sort of the immediate aftermath of George Floyd's murder.
mhm, mhm,
Yes. And much of this is coming up in the counseling room. So I allow myself, if you like, and I'm using this quite carefully. I know you understand how I'm using it. I allow myself to be used, yes, to
yes.
serve to
Yes.
serve the need of
Mhm,
the clients who come, be they brown, uh, black, and be they white. And I listen quite carefully to what's being communicated
mhm,
uh, because when I'm black and I'm working with a white, client, there is
Mm-hmm.
something that you call the status contradiction,
Mm-hmm.
because I'm meant to be in the position which has less power.
Yes. Yes.
But being a therapist, my position changes and I have power.
Mm-hmm.
How do I deal with it?
Mm-hmm.
Being used to be inferiorized.
Mm-hmm.
How would I have worked through that to manage my position now? How would my white client, who's used to being dominant, work with this new experience? And it seeps out in all sorts of different ways. Perhaps it might not allow me to help them properly
Mm-hmm.
in very little ways by trying to finish my sentences for me uh, and
But
sabotage the work.
and what you just said.
I'm sorry?
Or sometimes they make out they didn't understand what you just said.
Indeed,
Yeah.
indeed, indeed,
Yeah.
indeed.
To show you
Um,
English is in.
I'm
So
sorry.
I said sometimes they would use the English, the idea that your English is slightly different from
Yeah, the accent. Yes,
the accent.
yes,
Yeah.
yes,
Yes. Yes.
yes, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
And certain words are not pronounced properly.
Yes,
Yes.
are not
So
pronounced properly.
I'll
Uh-huh.
have a Ghanaian twist on it, and I have to say, yes. Could you say that again? You know.
To show you that this is our language and
But then you have to be comfortable with your Ghanaian, whatever accent you have. It is your language. Because we know Freud had a very strong German accent.
yes.
You know, he happens to be the father of psychoanalysis and psychotherapy, but he had a very strong German accent. Most of the mothers and fathers came from Eastern Europe, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and settled here, and they have very strong accents. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
so when it comes to other accents, I think
Mm-hmm.
there is a tendency to denigrate it, and we have to be careful about that. Yes. Mm.
And so what it sounds effectively is that because you were a trailblazer, you haven't had to sort of stand in the midst of other white colleagues and hope that somebody would choose you.
Um, haven't really had that experience, but it doesn't mean that I've been immune from
Mm,
racism. No,
that's where I
no.
was.
It was racism that led me to look for what would work for me.
Yes,
You see,
yes.
I could have gone to other very white institutes to train,
Hmm. Hmm.
but I made the decision that I wasn't going to do that.
Hmm.
What are my needs? And that is something that if you happen to be a client looking for a counselor, you have to choose what you think and feel would meet your need. It might mean you shopping around until you find what might work for you. Yes, no, I haven't been immune to racism at all. I've experienced it, but what I have done is to set up systems, to set up projects, to begin to interrogate those systems which are in place. At the moment, I am moving into the area of offering training, especially in the aftermath of George Floyd.
Hmm.
Uh, the number of organizations uh, who've come forward asking, come and teach us, come talk to us about these issues. And I'm going to be very, very busy doing that. But that's where we're needed to, you see, where we can begin to have communication across the divide, where we can work with allies and build bridges.
Okay.
Because we're not anti any color, we're anti oppression.
Yes,
Yes,
yeah, yes, yeah.
yes.
I like that because you said you looked at the system and made it work for you. You
Mm,
know, you chose, a route that would work for you and would
mm,
give you a place, which it has done.
mm.
Would you like to talk about your book?
Yeah, it's a book that sort of looks at all the various areas we've talked about. I think there were about 13 contributors looking at people who anthropologists, psychiatrists, psychotherapists from various persuasions, in the main more psychoanalytically inclined, but it was a rainbow coalition, black, white, brown people all came together and contributed with the sole aim of interrogating systemic racism, anti-oppression, intersectional issues, and people looked at the issue of supervision, how racism comes into it, and how the sort of power dynamics gets played out in supervision, which might sideline talking about those difficult issues of race and difference. I don't like saying race, racism, yes, because race is a fallacy. There's nothing like different races. There's only one race, yes,
One
and
human.
yes, and the thought of actually dividing people up and subjugating them is racism. So, yes, so supervision chapter looks at that. Other chapters look at the psychology of inferiorization, which BAME people sometimes carry with them. Assessment, how people come the into counseling, how they are assessed and their needs rightly met, and how issues around power at that entry stage is addressed. I looked at the post-colonial experience in that book, and there's been a lot of talk about, the phenomenon of passing, whereby if you're Jewish and you're white, you can pass for white,
Yes.
and sidestep the effects of anti-Semitism. It came from south, the south of the United States, the early part of the 20th century, where light-skinned black people would pass as white, and then they would live in fear of being discovered. But I was referencing the earlier reference I made to my identity, if you remember, that my name represents the dominant ethnic group, and behind it sits minority ethnic groups. And I could pass for any of those because of I'm able to be fluent in all the different languages. But then if you pass as one and deny the other, there's a mental health cost.
As a
how do
conflict.
you embrace all of it?
Mhm.
And some of us who come over here as Africans, sometimes we want to pass as Black British. We want to quickly change our accents so that we wouldn't be seen as African.
I know people
So,
who change their names.
yes. So I was looking at that phenomenon, which I called passing. Yes. It's an interesting book. It's called Intercultural Therapy, Challenges, Insights, and Developments. Yes.
And where can we buy the book from?
Amazon.
Mhm.
Amazon. Yes.
Or where can anybody find you if they wish to have counseling, supervision,
Ah,
invite for a talk?
uh, they can. I don't have a website, but they can find me on LinkedIn. If you Google me, I would come up. Yes, I think I would come up. Yes, uh, Baffour Ababio, it would come up. Yes, um, yeah.
And if I asked you to just leave us with something, what would it be? A thought.
Ah, I would say that we've been talking about the area of mental health. We've also been talking about the BAME community, impediments. And so I would say that one, uh, what does it mean to suffer in silence?
Mhm.
What would be gained by early intervention and seeking help very early? Number two, I think that's my biggest uh, area that I'm going to leave here. What does it mean to be, I don't like saying non-white because
Mhm.
it places white as a definer
Yeah.
of all others. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what does it mean to be, let me use myself, a black person
Mhm.
uh, who is out there walking around? Can I be apologetically black, where I
Mhm.
embrace my blackness,
Mhm.
where when I go to the supermarket, I'm not being intimidated by somebody who might be looking at me thinking, am I still something?
Mhm.
No matter my class or whatever, I'm still black.
Mhm.
Do I take those things on board? When I'm walking around, am I attracting and activating those notions of me as a dangerous black male? No. It's how to begin to live life, access one's potential as a black person, and be, I'm not talking about being brash, but just being apologetically black, being aware of what's happening in your body and in your mind when you're there, those uh, attempts to, for your mind to be captured
Mhm.
and to placate the other in
Mhm.
everything that you do. Yes,
Mhm. I
to
think
to to
good.
sidestep that and
Mhm.
to be oneself.
Mhm.
Yes, I think that's a good mental health tip.
What can I say but thank you?
Mm,
Thank you for your
yeah,
time. Thank you for all that you've shared personally and in your work. And we look forward to seeing you again. And hopefully, next time it will be in the studio.
thank you so much, Lydia. Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity.
What an evening. It's been really interesting looking at mental health from not only a male perspective, but as a believer of any faith and as humans, how it impacts us, especially in the vein community. Thank you, and look forward to seeing you next week.
LCBN television broadcasts 24/7 on UK Freeview Channel 271, Roku TV, Amazon Fire TV, Android TV, Apple TV, Google TV, See Love World, LCBNTV.com, LifeConTV.com.